Well, hello everyone, and welcome to week 5 of our Lenten series, Make a Difference, following your passion and finding your place to serve. So I hope that last week you were able to do this spiritual gifts inventory. And if you weren't, just go over to UMC Discipleship and you'll find a spiritual gifts inventory there to be able to check that out, see where God has given you gifts and the ways in which you might be able to use them. So this week was a hard week for reading. It's hard because it really talks about pain and suffering and where we find hope. In fact, the opening quote for chapter 5, and if you haven't read it yet, stop now, go read, come back. But the opening quote says, "If you want to know whether God is alive, you must go, not to where all is well, but into places of brokenness and suffering. There are depths of reality, dimensions of God, releases of healing energy that flow into the world only through the power of faithful suffering." That is by Peter Story. And so I love this little guy right here because I think he's going to bring us a little bit of laughter. So if you're feeling that this is really heavy, you need a break for a moment, thinking about suffering and pain, and also where God might be calling you to reach out in the midst of suffering and pain, I want you to just look over here at my little sloth friend and just take a deep breath and remember that hope that we all hold on to. So over the last weeks of our Lenten study together, as we've been gathering as a group, each week somebody lights a candle. They're invited to light a candle to and speak the name of somebody who has given them hope in hard times, or has spoken into their lives about faith, or has kind of directed them into where God might be calling them. So we've heard stories of ministers, we've heard stories of friends, we've heard stories of our relatives. So I'd love for you to think about who is a person who has been that light for you, who has helped light that spark in your life or planted a seed that maybe helped you make a difference. I know for me, some of the people who've most touched my life are the ones who have come in the moments of the greatest pain and suffering of my life. And those people have been able to hold up a light for me in the midst of darkness, be able to remind me that I might not be able to see the hope or the light in that moment, but they knew that it was there, they could see it, and they would hold on to that for me until I could hold on to that for myself. I think that is such a beautiful way of looking at our struggles and our pains and our sorrows. You know, we're in a society where we love to just rush through the suffering, rush through the pain because it's too uncomfortable and it's too hard for us. Someone shared this morning about inviting somebody to go visit someone in the hospital who was suffering from cancer. And the person who they invited to go wouldn't go because they didn't know what they could do. And they didn't want to have to sit in that room of suffering and pain because they couldn't hold it. And God calls us as disciples to go into the midst of that pain and suffering, to be the advocate, be the hands and feet of Jesus at work in our world. But it's so hard for us, right? I mean, we don't really like our own pain and suffering, let alone seeing other people suffer and have loss. We struggle to find words. We want to fix it, to be really helpful. We want to produce, right? So when we go home, we want to say, okay, we helped this person do this, 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 and this. But often the way in which God calls us to go out into the world is just to be, to simply be. It's really difficult, right? It's really difficult just to be present, to be a witness of somebody's sorrow, suffering, pain. And so I want you to think about what your greatest pain or suffering has been. This morning we shared stories around the table of people who, their own stories of suffering and pain and loss. And then they shared about the ways in which they were able to see God at work, to be able to have a little bit of light in the midst of that darkness. So what's your story? What has been one of those pivotal moments where you have suffered, but you have been able to experience the light of Christ? We all, I think, have our stories. In the midst of deep suffering and pain and loss, there has been this also intimate relationship or a drawing near of God in those moments. I like to think of those moments, especially as when the veil is thinner and God feels more near. And some of that's because we're more receptive, right? We're seeking God. We are desperate to hear God. We're desperate to understand and to know why we're going through that, or to have answers to our prayers. So some of it is because we are honestly seeking. Some of it's because we're vulnerable. We're able to let go of some of our pride or some of the ways in which we believe that God is at work in the world, or we're able to kind of have some of those walls that we've built up knocked down completely. And so God can enter in a new way. Some of it is because when it is really dark, just a little bit of light helps light up an entire room and make you be able to see in a different way. So how have you been able to experience that light in the midst of suffering? And we talked about this morning about how it's been in those moments of pain and loss and suffering, when we have been stretched, that we have these new openings for God to be able to enter into our lives, to be able to draw us in a new way and to speak to us and allow us to be able to understand a deeper way of that hope that God has given to us. So the question is, what will we allow God to do with our broken places? Where will we allow God to speak to us and to enter in? Those intimate moments where our faith really becomes real and tangible. So some of us talked about how in those moments of deep hurt and suffering, we were angry with God. We were really angry. Like, how could you allow this to happen, God? How could you allow this to happen to my people? How could you allow this to happen to me? I have followed you. I've been faithful. And how there's some shame with being angry with God. But it's important for us to know that it is okay to be angry with God. That even if we don't believe that, like, we still feel it inside of us that we're angry, right? And so to be able to trust that God's not going to smite us because we're angry, to be able to trust God with our feelings and emotions, our anger, as well as our joys, like, that is a true relationship. It's only with the people that I love the most that I'm able to be angry and honest with, right? And so it's important for us to be honest with God, to cry out to God, to be angry if that's what we feel, or to be able to seek in a new way. So knowing that for ourselves, but also giving permission for other people as well, to not always have the right words to say, especially those churchy words, everything happens for a reason, God wanted an angel. Those kinds of sayings make us feel better because we had something to say, but they don't always make the other person feel better. Sometimes it's just really important to have somebody be able to sit with you and to be honest with how you're feeling, right? And so sometimes the best words are, man, that really is hard. That really sucks. I'm sorry. It's okay to be upset and to be angry. It's okay, right? Allowing people to have that permission is so helpful for them in a hard time. So suffering, right? It's really interesting talking about suffering going into Holy Week, because we see how Jesus goes into this time of suffering, where he cries out to God, where he's carrying his cross and he needs others to come and to help him carry it. there's all of these ways in which we can draw strength from that suffering story. And also know that God draws near, especially during those times, that God understands. Jesus wept for his brother Lazarus. Jesus cries out in the midst of his pain and suffering. And so God understands what we go through. So how does that change us? How does our suffering change who we are? And how does God use that suffering for good, right? We hear that all things work together for the good of those who love Christ Jesus, right? And so we know that our suffering, there will be goodness out of it. But what does that goodness look like? Well, that goodness often looks like being able then to be present and enter into somebody else's suffering, to be able to see people in a different light, to be able to understand that deep pain and suffering, and to be able to hear their stories and to listen and learn about how to help out. And so as we shifted from thinking about our own suffering, we started to think about, well, what are some of the places, deepest hurts, deepest sufferings of our community? Our community in Parker or wherever you live, but also your community as far as maybe work groups, friends, family, those places that you are networked in. What kind of suffering and pain do you see in those areas? And if you don't see any, maybe it's time to ask God to open your eyes, to be able to give you eyes to see the ways in which there might be suffering and pain. So some of the ideas that we came across this morning as we talked were food insecurity and home insecurity, right? We know that we live in one of the most affluent counties in the nation. But also as we are driving by, we're seeing more and more homeless people. We're also seeing more people who are lined up for food trucks or food banks. And so when you live in an affluent country or a county, a lot of times people hide those needs. They hide that pain, that loss that they have, that insecurity that they're feeling. Sometimes those things go hidden, right? It's kind of like the person who buys a really huge house, but in the inside they can't furnish it because they don't have enough money. And so we don't always know what's going on behind closed doors. We don't always know the ways in which people are in need and hurting. So those were two places. And then another one was mental health. We all been carrying so much for the last 2 years. Some of us have been carrying it for even longer. There's some mental health space there that is a real place of suffering for a lot of people. So those were three of the areas that we identified in our class. Curious what places that you feel in our community there are suffering. And then our job is to kind of figure out if our gifts line up in those areas. If God is calling us to make a difference in those places, to be able to enter in a new way, to be able to be an agent of God's grace and love in those spaces, to be able to bring about healing. And maybe for some of us, it's just sitting and listening. Maybe for others, it's hearing that pain and going, okay, how can I help? Do I go help out at a food bank? Do I listen to my neighbors and bring them food if they're in need? Do I listen to somebody over coffee, just their story, and maybe try to find resources for them in the community? So as we begin to enter into people's suffering, our hearts begin to stir in a new way as God is calling us to use the pain and suffering that we've had, but also to be able to enter in a new way, to enter into somebody's pain and loss and suffering. And so that's just a quick thing of what we talked about in the group. Again, at the end of this chapters are always great questions for reflection. And so we talked a lot about hope. What's the difference between a wishful thought and hope, and real hope for us? We talked about how a lot of times faithful hope, Christian hope, is only felt, right? Sometimes it can only be seen in the rearview mirror, the ways in which God was present with you and was helping you and leading you in those spaces, that sometimes we can't see it in the midst of our suffering, but it's something that we feel. And how can we bring that hope and peace and love into new spaces for people who don't understand that? There are some wonderful scriptures and stories, so I would encourage you again to sit with those questions of reflection and also some of those action ideas. I wanted to leave you with this poem that my friend and colleague Dale Carl Fredrickson wrote. He writes a lot of poetry, and it reads like this. Your mistake is thinking you are alone in all of this. Such sighs of sadness are like the waves. But your aloneness is an opening, and midnight grief is not enemy, but friend. Every day in the quiet before dawn, love is born in darkness, and all creation begins again. May we be a light in that darkness, a light into the world as Christ's light shines in us and through us. We'll see you back here next week for week 6.